Good morning. Today is Low Sunday, which is also known as the first Sunday after Easter or the second Sunday of Easter, however confusing you might want to make it. Today is still technically within the octave of Easter, so we're still technically within the 8 days following Easter, which meant to be a time of great joy. Now, unfortunately, many of our fellow Catholics, particularly those in the Roman Catholic Church, are currently in mourning because of the passing of Pope Francis. And we in the Liberal Catholic Church, we also send our condolences to Pope Francis. Although he's not the leader of our church, he was a great spiritual man, and we hope that God grants eternal light unto him. Now, the collect, epistle and gospel actually help us through times like this, times of joy and also times of sorrow. And we actually, the collect here sets the scene. The collect tells us, O Lord Christ, by whose eternal sacrifice we exist and in whose victory triumph, grant that in joy or in sorrow we may never lose our grateful memory of thine unchanging love, who livest and reignest, God, throughout all ages of ages. So here, what God tells us is that through his eternal sacrifice, we can find strength in times of joy or in times of sorrow. And there is a particular tool, a particular thing that Jesus has actually given to us, a very, very powerful gift that can help us to do this. And this gift is the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. Now, we, like the Roman Catholic Church, are a sacramental church. We believe in the importance of the sacraments and in celebrating the sacraments and in performing the ceremonies around the sacraments properly and correctly and accurately to make sure that we can spread God's grace onto the world. And the gospel of today in particular tells a story that tells us something very powerful about the sacrament of the Eucharist. Now, for those who might not be too familiar with Christian and Catholic theology, the sacrament of the Eucharist is essentially the revisiting, the reliving of the Last Supper that we perform on most Sundays. Whenever we've got a priest, we have Mass. And when we say Mass, we are essentially reliving the Last Supper event, but also at the same time, we are provided with a wondrous gift, which is the real presence of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the specifics of the real presence, except to say, because that would take a very long time, except to say that churches in the Catholic tradition, we believe that at the time of consecration, so when the priest says the special words of power, the bread and the wine are actually turned into the substance of Christ's body and blood, which essentially means that every Sunday we are reliving Christ's presence. And that is a very powerful gift that can really help us. It can help bring stability and joy to our lives, even in times of sorrow. And today's gospel, as I indicated, tells a great story about this particular gift. This story can actually be taken as an allegory and as a reference to the entire Eucharist itself. And this is the story of the supper at Emmaus, told in the gospel according to St. Luke. And in this story, a couple of the disciples, they're very sad. They're in a lot of sorrow because, Jesus just died. But they're also in a bit of a state of astonishment and shock because they just had Mary Magdalene and the women coming up to them and telling them, oh, Jesus is risen. We saw the angels and we saw him. They went back to the tomb to have a look. They couldn't find Jesus there, but the tomb was, as the women had said, empty. So they're walking along to this village called Emmaus and they meet a stranger along the way. Now, unbeknownst to them, this stranger is Jesus Christ. But they don't realize this. They don't quite recognize him. Even though along the way, he starts talking to them about the scriptures. I mean, this whole time Jesus plays dumb. He pretends like he doesn't know what's actually happening and why they would be sad, what's going on in Jerusalem. So the disciples tell him. Jesus then starts going into scripture and, preaching to them, essentially. They eventually get to supper and they start eating. Disciples still not realizing that this is Jesus. But then at one point, Jesus broke bread and blessed it and gave it to them. And at this point, their eyes and hearts were opened and they realized that this is Jesus Christ. And when he did this thing, this sacramental act of breaking the bread and blessing it, he vanished. They realized that it was him and he vanished. And they say, there's a great passage here where they say, "Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us the scriptures?" And I personally love this. I think this is great because it's an excellent description of our Eucharistic service, of our Mass that we celebrate. At the start of every Mass, we come in and we have what's known as the teaching part of the Mass, where we say the Epistle and the Gospel, we have the introit and we sing some hymns, and we also have the sermon during this part. And this is the part where we become acquainted with the scriptures. Just as here, this was the part here that's relevant is when Jesus was walking with the disciples and he was telling them about the scriptures. Then after that part of the Mass, it actually reaches the crescendo when we actually get to the consecration. And then at that moment of consecration, just as the disciples were in Emmaus, we are greeted with the real presence and likeness of Christ. He descends to earth to give us this gift. And then afterwards, we actually take communion. We consume the bread and the wine. Christ disappears, just as he disappeared to the disciples. But by this point, though, our hearts are burning and Christ is with us. And we can take this with us. We can use this gift to further us in our spiritual evolution. The Eucharist is primarily intended to be a gift of grace that brings us closer to God. And this story of the Supper of Emmaus, it's I believe personally, that it is a scriptural and mystical explanation of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. We do not know Christ in the sense that even though we may have some spiritual knowledge, we may know about the Christ within. We may know that we can expand our consciousness and elevate our consciousness to a level where we recognize Christ, but we are still mortal. We still have physical human limitations. The way we get closer to Christ and the way we begin to know Christ is through opening our hearts. And the Eucharist is one of these wonderful sacraments that our church offers that allows you to open your heart to Christ. And as we celebrate the Eucharist, as we continue the Eucharist, then it helps us to do what Peter was described as saying and doing in today's epistle, which was from the Acts of the Apostles. But basically here, he says that God raised Jesus up the third day and showed him openly, not to all the people, but unto witnesses chosen before of God, even to us, who did eat and drink with him after he rose from the dead. So here what we're being told is that if we participate in the Eucharist, if we come to Mass, if we take communion, we are eating and drinking with Christ's real presence. And therefore we become witnesses of Christ's resurrection, which is what we continue to celebrate this entire Easter time. We've still got the Paschal candle burning in commemoration of the fact that during these 40 days following Christ's death and resurrection, he walked the earth and he continued teaching and granting more and more spiritual knowledge to the disciples. In fact, this was a very busy time. We had the Supper of Emmaus, which we talked about in the Gospel, but during this time as well, Jesus instituted the priesthood and instituted a number of other different sacraments. So This is a very, very powerful time. And whether it's a time of joy or a time of sorrow, we need to remember the constancy of God's love and the constancy of God's grace, which is made manifest to us every Sunday if we participate in the Eucharist. So I encourage you to meditate on this and consider whether attending a service and taking communion might be of benefit for you spiritually. I personally can say from my experience that it has really enriched my life, and continued participation in the Eucharist does help to bring one closer to God and to that level of consciousness that we all strive to achieve as Christians. Thank you.